Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, let's just dive right in. When you hear the phrase fairy tale, what immediately pops into your head? Are you picturing, a children's book packed with tiny, sparkly winged creatures? Or maybe a slightly goofy bedtime story you outgrew decades ago? Well, if that's where your mind goes, J.R.R. Tolkien's legendary essay on fairy stories is going to turn those assumptions completely upside down. Today, we're exploring a true masterclass on storytelling. This isn't just about elves and dragons, right? It's a profound, impassioned defense of fantasy as a fundamental human right.
So, here's our roadmap for today's journey. We'll start with Welcome to the Perilous Realm, dip into the cauldron of story, take a look at their banishment to the nursery, explore recovery and true escape, and then finish up with the ultimate consolation. Section 1. Welcome to the Perilous Realm, shattering the illusion of tiny sprites. You see, there's a really stark contrast between what we modernly think of as a fairy and what Tolkien actually knew it to be. Over time, especially thanks to writers like Shakespeare and Michael Drayton, fairies were literally shrunk down. They became these diminutive, fluttering little sprites hiding out in cowslip flowers, wearing hats made of bat wings. And honestly, Tolkien absolutely detested this whole flower and butterfly minuteness. To him, true fantasy wasn't about tiny people at all. It was about the perilous realm, this vast, dangerous, and incredibly majestic world driven by deep magic.
Actually, a true fairy story isn't necessarily about fairies at all. It's about Faërie. Faërie is the perilous realm itself. It's an almost indescribable state of being. We're talking shoreless seas, uncounted stars, beauty that acts as an actual enchantment, and, this is key, an ever-present peril. It even includes mortal men when they become enchanted. It's all about the magical air that blows in that country. If the magic is treated seriously, right, not just laughed off or explained away as a mere dream, then boom, you are in the realm of Faërie.
Moving to Section 2, the Cauldron of Story. Where do fairy stories come from?
Now, instead of handing us some dry academic history of folklore, Tolkien gives us this magnificent metaphor. He describes the history of fairy stories as a giant pot of soup, the cauldron of story, that has just always been boiling. Over centuries, new bits have continually been tossed into the stock. The cooks throw in real historical figures like kings, pieces of ancient mythology, romantic tropes of nameless men and women, and even the stray bones of tradition. Take King Arthur, for example. He might have been a totally real historical figure once upon a time, but he was thrown into the pot, boiled for ages with myth and magic, and eventually emerged as a king of Faërie.
And this brilliantly illustrates Tolkien's point about how stories evolve, using a wonderfully tasteful bit of humor. Tolkien points out that historians often try to dissect stories to find the so-called original truth. It's kind of like rejecting a story about the Archbishop of Canterbury slipping on a banana skin just because other people have slipped on banana skins. But to the storyteller, the real truth is that the Archbishop and the banana skin were both simply put into the pot. The raw elements of a story are constantly being reused, reattached to new figures to cook up something entirely new and flavorful.
Section 3. Banishment to the nursery. Are fairy stories just for kids?
Tolkien strongly disagreed with the idea that kids somehow have a special biological connection to fantasy. In fact, he argued that this association is basically just a total accident of our domestic history. He compares this relegation to old-fashioned furniture. Think about it. Adults simply lost their taste for this kind of art, they didn't really understand it anymore, and so what did they do? They thoughtlessly stuffed it away in the nursery, the playroom, mostly just because they didn't mind if it got misused or battered by the kids.
But here's the reality. Fairy stories are a natural human taste. They are not intrinsically childish. I mean, just because we give a kid a simplified version of history or science doesn't mean history and science are only for kids, right? The exact same goes for fantasy. Tolkien bluntly argues that if a fairy story is worth reading at all, it is absolutely worthy to be written for and read by adults. Actually, scratch the idea that it's just for kids. This innate taste for the magical and the profound actually tends to increase with age and maturity.
Which brings us to Section 4, Recovery and True Escape. The purpose of fantasy.
So the first major benefit here is recovery. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, it's the regaining of a clear view. In our day-to-day lives, things tend to become trite. We lock them up in our mental hoard, we assume we know them, and we basically stop actually looking at them. Tolkien says fantasy helps us clean our mental windows. By placing fundamental things like stone, wood, iron, bread, and wine into a magical setting, they are suddenly made luminous again.
By encountering a dragon or a centaur in a story, we might snap back to the real world and be totally startled anew by the beauty of a real horse or a dog. We recover our fresh vision.
And this natural desire for recovery builds perfectly into the concept of escape. Escapism is so often tossed around as an insult by literary critics, implying this sort of cowardly refusal to face reality. But Tolkien completely reclaims the word. He defines escape as a highly practical, heroic desire to break free from the noise, the stench, and the ugliness of the modern robot age. Honestly, why shouldn't we want to escape or at least condemn the sheer horror of factories and mass production?
This specific comparison completely reframes the whole argument. Critics of fantasy are essentially confusing the flight of the deserter with the escape of the prisoner. Think about the difference. A deserter is a coward running away from their duty, but a prisoner who finds themselves locked in a miserable, ugly jail, is entirely justified in thinking about the world outside those prison walls and ultimately trying to break free. Finding refuge in a secondary world isn't cowardice, it's a heroic resistance against the ugliness of the primary world.
And finally, Section 5, the ultimate consolation, the joy of the catastrophe. To explain this final piece, Tolkien invented a real hallmark term, eucatastrophe. Now, you know what a catastrophe is, right? A sudden, terrible disaster. Well, the prefix eu means good, so a eucatastrophe is literally the good catastrophe. It is that miraculous grace of a happy ending, that sudden joyous turn in a story when all hope seems completely lost. It doesn't deny that sorrow or failure exist, not at all, but it powerfully denies universal final defeat. When that sudden turn hits you in a story, it gives you a literal catch of the breath.
Tolkien beautifully describes this moment, saying we get a piercing glimpse of joy that for a moment passes outside the frame. In his epilogue, he actually took this concept to its absolute philosophical peak. He imparted that this piercing joy we feel in fantasy reflects a deeper, underlying truth bursting right through the narrative. For Tolkien himself, this ultimately connected to the Christian story. He viewed the Gospels as the greatest true fairy story where the birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history, and the resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the incarnation. Now, whether one shares his faith or not, his broader point stands. This profound, breathtaking joy simply feels like a glimpse of ultimate truth.
Ultimately, fantasy remains a human right. We are what he calls sub-creators. We create these intricate secondary worlds filled with deep magic, elves, and sometimes profound sorrow, because we were made in the image of a maker. Building these worlds isn't some foolish waste of time. It is an absolutely essential, uplifting, and incredibly potent part of the human spirit.
So, as we wrap up this explainer today, I really want to leave you with a provocative question to ponder. As you consume secondary worlds today, whether that's in books, art, or film, where will you seek that sudden glimpse of joy within our own primary world? How can you use the magic of Faërie to clean your own mental windows and see the everyday world around you with fresh, wondrous eyes? Keep seeking that joy, and definitely keep exploring. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey through the Perilous Realm.